So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about disability life writing, and I'm going to leave that what is disability life writing until maybe the end, and we can talk about what is it. I'm teaching a class right now on disability life writing, and I've recently published an article in Teachers College Record. I don't think it's out in print yet. I've gotten a copy of the page proof, so it should be out soon. And then I also wrote an article on Lynn Manning's weights, which we're going to talk a little bit about Lynn Manning about halfway through. And so this talk is sort of a little bit from both of those articles and a little bit from my experiences this semester teaching this class. And the class has been just a riot. We're reading, I think, 8 different authors, and 4 of them, one has come to class, and 3 have Skyped in. And so it's been fabulous to actually engage with the authors that we're reading in the class. And so I can answer questions about the class and all that kind of stuff later if you would like. But I thought I would share this with you. This is actually from last year, not this year, but I will say that I almost missed my plane coming here because it took 45 minutes to de-ice the plane this morning. And so I was up at 4, but still almost didn't get here. And this is in my driveway. We always take an annual photograph when the snow gets over my head. And so I don't know if you can tell, but I have climbed up to the top of this mound of snow, and that's my driveway. I don't know, I'm really bad with time, and so I'm just going to talk about this rather than actually have you do it. But this was the very first thing I did in my class, is we did a quick write, and I made the students write an autobiography of a body part. And it was a really interesting assignment because what we learned from that experience was that when the students wrote those autobiographies of body parts, almost all of them had to do with trauma or difference. And it was a really interesting thing to think about, how when we think about ourselves and we tell our stories, that we visit the places where we are different, not where we are the same. That story almost requires difference. If we're all the same, then the story's not that interesting, is it? And so, although we spend a lot of time in special ed diagnosing and identifying difference and thinking of it as a problem, from a disability life writing perspective, it becomes the material from which good stories come. And so, right from the very first moment of the class, we sort of thought about what disability means and how is it important to our own identity, to our histories, to the stories that we tell about ourselves, to the stories that we hold close to ourselves. The other thing that it did was it reminded us about bodily vulnerabilities, but also the risk of telling one's story. I wanted students to start the class with a little humility, to think about how we normally read in graduate school, which is, and I wanted them to read more carefully, more slowly. I wanted them to think about how the author savored every word that they put in what they wrote, and how that story was really connected to a life. And so we started the class with this kind of humility and reverence for the life stories that we were going to read. And I think that was a really wonderful activity. And it was also a reminder about how in special education, disabled people have been spoken about and spoken for, but rarely listened to. And I think this is a really good quote by Mark Sherry, and really appropriate in terms of the ways that we go about doing special education. We're all about knowing, but in a very narrow way do we know about kids. We know about them in terms of their test scores. We know about them in terms of how they measure up in particular ways. But our practice, at least in my experience in special ed, has not been full of insider stories. And so I think this was a nice reminder also about what can be gained from listening to students rather than just testing them or examining them in other ways. I was just talking to Susie about a special double issue of Learning Disability Quarterly that David Connor, my co-author on the book, and Deb Gallagher and I, we edited this special double issue of Learning Disabilities Quarterly. And those of you in special ed know that's a kind of a traditional special ed journal. And the theme of the journal was pluralizing methodologies in the field of learning disabilities. And the reason I bring this up is that I think that special ed has been so dominated by quantitative and clinical kinds of research that it really, it was no surprise to us when we went about writing one of the articles for the first issue. We did a journal search of that journal and all of the major journals in special ed, and we charted out quantitative studies, qualitative studies, mixed methods, and then thematics, how many were about assessment, how many were about, so those of you in special ed know what those findings were. It wouldn't surprise you. But the level of quantitative, the level of imbalance between qualitative and quantitative was really quite shocking. And we're not even talking about other kinds of research that, that was one of the questions we asked. Well, is everything that's not quantitative qualitative? So is narrative research, is archival research, like the kind that I did, was that qualitative? I'm not so sure. But even if we put everything else that people do that's not quantitative, I'm not remembering the exact numbers, but it was a very, very slim percentage of research in the field that that represents anything but quantitative research. And so the predominant ways that we've gone about knowing about students is very positivistic, very narrow, reductionistic. So I think disability life writing could be an important place to start learning about students differently and learning about disability differently. And so I have a couple quotes here. One's from Deb Gallagher that I quite like. It's, in its unwavering allegiance to empiricism, special ed has adopted an ideology that posits disability as an individual problem, foreclosing different ways of knowing about disability. And so that sort of gets at what I'm talking about there. Lorraine Code, who's a really interesting feminist philosopher, she says, what we need is a different kind of script, one that has the potential to unsettle and disrupt storylines that are apparently seamless and can serve as an irritant to the dominant paradigm of knowledge about disability. And I thought, God, if that's not a call to arms for all of us, let's be an irritant to the dominant paradigm of knowledge. So all of the doc students in here, that's your marching orders. Go on and be an irritant. So why do I have this picture up here? So I was in the subway in New York last year, and I just thought it was quite interesting. Every time the subway stopped, more Santas got in. And the subway filled up with Santas, okay? And so I started to think about this photo in terms of this slide, and I thought, running into this parade of Santas heading into the city, I wondered what parents were telling their kids as the subway filled up with Santas with each stop of the train. Shifting the paradigm of disability is equally unsettling to some of our special ed colleagues, I think. So the value in narrative is that it allows for the subjective experience of disability, and it invites different ways of knowing about disability that can talk back and even subvert clinical ways of knowing about disability. And so it interrupts this seamless kind of storyline. The thing that is most important for us to disrupt, I think, is this idea that disability is about deficit. Because it creates such damage in terms of teachers. When teachers think about including kids with disabilities in their class, because of the ways that we have taught about disabilities and thought about disabilities, all they can think about is, oh no, right? This is going to be a problem. This is going to take away from whatever good things are going on in my classroom. They can only think about it as a subtractive experience, rather than what will this kid add to my class? What will this kid bring that's not already here? How can I think about this as an opportunity to inform my teaching? I love when Tom Skurdick talks about disability as a teacher. When you have a kid with disabilities in your class, that child will teach you how to be a better teacher. And I think that's a really wonderful thing that kids with disabilities can do for our classes. So I also wanted to think about ways that we can imagine disability otherwise. That's one of the real values in terms of disability life writing. And what do you notice about these international wheelchair or access symbols? The one on the very left is the traditional sign that we've had with us for a very long time. And I tried to find a picture. There's a graffiti thing that people are doing in Boston where they're taking these signs and pasting over them a symbol that looks more like this one. And they're just plastering right on the top. So what do you notice about the second one versus the first one? It's moving, right? The first one is, I mean, I don't know where the guy's arms are, but maybe they're just, like this on top of the little handles, right? But he's not an active person. I don't know why I think it's a he, but it's sort of the universal symbol. The second one is absolutely active. But here's what disability life writing can do, okay? It can turn the whole thing on its head, okay? And so the value of fiction, film, life writing, disability performance art, visual art, poetry, creative writing, dance, and I could go on, has this potential to really subvert our thinking about disability. Now, you might be surprised at this, but on the right-hand side that's all pink, people within disability studies, people in the humanities, and I'll mention like David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder, Lenny Davis. And Lenny Davis is really interesting to me because he's sort of skeptical about disability life writing, but he's written lots of memoirs. And so that I always think that's funny. But these are some of the concerns that people have within disability studies have said about memoir or disability life writing. They said, well, if we're not careful, it can reify the overcoming script, or these stories can be too personal, too confessional. They're individual, they focus on the individual rather than the social aspect of disability. And in disability studies, the social model, we like to divide up impairment from disability. And we say, well, impairment is about biology, it's about, a known kind of fact about a body, and disability is the social consequence of having that impairment. And so what they worry about is that the narrative can focus too much on the personal and forget about the social and political aspects of disability. They also worry that it will be read as an overcoming script, that it will be read as an individual struggle. And so these are the ways that people have been skeptical, even within disability studies. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that all disability studies scholars think disability life writing is necessarily a great thing. And yet on the left-hand side, is that right? Yeah. On the left-hand side are ways that people have talked about disability life writing as really positive, that it's really a counter-narrative to the deficit model of disability or counter-diagnostic. It can talk back to our dominant understandings of disabilities, and it's written from the inside of experience instead of from the outside, and so it's these insider perspectives. And so what do we make of this? We have these real differences of opinion about, is disability life writing dangerous in terms of the social model of disability, or is it, counter-diagnostic and really part of the project of disability studies? And so I think when I started to think about this and why I gave you the handout that I gave you, is that I have to admit that there are plenty of disability narratives that reflect an internalization of the overcoming script. I mean, it's a very popular genre. The person, overcomes their disability and they write their memoir, and we've seen these on TV, we've read them in books. But some of this skepticism might also be a reluctance to deal openly with impairment within the social model. That people who are very staunch social model folks don't want to talk about impairment because impairment's dangerous. If we talk about impairment, then we run the risk of, oh, you're just talking about disability as negative again, or as something that is painful, or as something that is problematic. And they don't necessarily want to focus on that. They think it diminishes from the social, political side of things. They worry that it will undermine the social model tenets, reinforce ableist assumptions, that disability is all about personal tragedy. And yet, I have to wonder, why is this genre so popular, right? I mean, it is a very, very popular genre within memoir. In fact, if you go to Amazon and you look up memoir, read through the list. I mean, disability will be all over it. Go back to the first night of my class. What did we talk about? We talked about times that we hurt our bodies. We talked about our ears that were different. We talked about, you know, the places that we didn't feel, parts of our bodies that we didn't feel were normative. And so there's a lot of interesting struggle around memoir. And I don't think we've necessarily come up once and for all, is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? Okay, but I think the purpose of my talk tonight is maybe it's about critical reading practices. It's how we read these memoirs. It's how we read and go after the meaning within these memoirs that really bring out its emancipatory potential for students in our classes. So here is the overcoming script of the supercrip. The publishing industry, like Hollywood, privileges emotional stories of disability as tragedy or triumphal stories of individuals overcoming adversity by sheer force of will or determination. Here's the worry, right? That we're only going to be talking about the blind ski racer and the disabled man who climbs Mount Everest and the, you know, I mean, it goes on. I pasted a bunch of these book jackets on here before I did the titles. These titles are actual titles of newspaper clippings. They're headlines from newspapers. And so I decided that it's not just about the publishing industry, but it's also sort of popular press and media where these stories come up. And so this ideology of cure or care is really, really popular. And the problem with overcoming narratives, I think the real damage that they do, is that when you read one of these stories, it sets the individual who's the subject of the story as the exception to the rule. Okay? They're the exceptional person. But for that relationship to work, the rule, the person that's the exception allows the rule to stay in place, and the rule is usually about stereotypes. So for this whole story to work, we have to think about disabled people not really being able to ski, or disabled people not really running marathons, or not being able to do things that other people do. And so the overcoming script is sort of sets that stereotype as the ground upon which the disabled subject emerges. And so I think, you know, this is something that if we teach memoirs in our classes, we have to understand that this genre is very popular. Students really like it. They'll say things like, well, I think it is inspiring to see this disabled person doing these great things, or I think this is really great. You know, what's wrong with celebrating somebody who's done something really great? And I think this is probably, if you're going to teach memoirs and you're not careful, this is the whole time, this is what you're going to be talking about, but why isn't this, you know, why is this problematic? And disabled people themselves really get angry at these images because they're really just the flip side of ableist stereotypes. And so here we have into the minefield. I'm going to write my memoir, right? And I have people in disability studies who are skeptical of what I want to do. I have all these overcoming scripts and skepticism around those. And I think really, this quote really captures it for me. And it says, to tell one's story and to be understood, one is inevitably caught within webs of meaning, informed by these dominant scripts and normative assumptions. Even as we push back against these scripts, we call them into being. And this is really, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that we need those overcoming scripts to be rendered intelligible. Like, those scripts are out there. And if we're going to write our memoir, they're out there, they're out in the world, and we write, even if we reject them, we have to touch them. And that's the really weird thing about rejecting or resisting something, is that if I'm going to resist you, I have to touch you. And so we're constantly engaging with these scripts, whether we like it or not. I think we have to deal with them. We have to talk about them. We have to think about what are they doing, what are the assumptions within the text, how do we think through how we're being called in certain ways by the text to think certain things. You know, I think this is just unavoidable to deal with this. I want to argue that disability life writing can and should be seen as a form of social action. First, I think disability life writing helps us to complicate disability and impairment scenarios. Often when people are writing narratives, they're really, they're engaged with disability and impairment. It's not one or the other, and they're not set as in opposition. They're seen as more dialectical and complicated than that. So they're situated here right at the intersection of the biological and the discursive, between the social and the political and the personal. This is really, I think, the value of them. If we have the special ed model, the deficit model on the one side, and we have the social model on the other side, I put disability life writing as really complicating the two and operating right from that crosshairs in between. I think if you're careful and you select disability life writing that reflects people who are multiply situated in terms of gender, race, sexuality, social class, they can really be a way to complicate our notions of politics. You know, how do we understand, I mean, I've been really involved in this. How do we understand disability without acknowledging the way that it's so tied up in race, both historically and in popular culture and in our ways of thinking, whether we talk about eugenics or whether we talk about overrepresentation of students with disabilities in special education. And so I think looking at narratives that are really multiply situated can help us look at the way ableism plays out in really different ways depending on other identity categories. I also think that it can dislodge the medical model. At the same time, it complicates the social model. And so it really does a double kind of work that I find really productive. And I want to just point out one more thing here. The third, simultaneously personal, social, political. Here's an example of what I want to talk about there. The social model I've talked about a little bit, how it really wants to focus on the social. And I think that I acknowledge I am a social model person. You know, I sort of cut my teeth on the social model, if you will. When I was in my doctoral program, there were no disability studies programs or classes at the University of Georgia. And yet I came from teaching. And I had a very politicized view of disability. On my very first day in the classroom, actually, it was before my first day. It was my first day I was introduced to the principal at my school. And I was starting a brand new program for kids with moderate intellectual disabilities. And the principal was giving me a tour of the school. And he took me into my classroom, which was this huge cavernous room that was completely empty. It had been the art room. And when the state of West Virginia came in and they said, oh, you have to have a program for kids with intellectual disabilities because you're busing them 45 minutes both ways and you have 12 kids, you absolutely have enough, you have too many kids for a classroom, but you definitely have to start a classroom. And so what they did is they took the money from the art program and made this classroom. So I was very popular in my first job, as you can imagine. And so the teachers went in, and it was like the Grinch that stole Christmas. They came in and took everything out of the room. I mean, there was not a piece of chalk, there wasn't a pencil, there wasn't anything. I thought at least there'd be like some art supplies or something, no, it was gone. But anyway, so I was there, and I was supposed to order all of the stuff for the classroom. Like, so what's this class supposed to look like? What do you need? We have no idea. Do what you want. We'll pay for it. And so I'm brand new first year teacher, and I'm like, well, I think we need this. I think we need that. I was very cocky, as only you can be when you're a very first year teacher, right? So anyway, though, he started giving me a tour of the school, and he said, well, this classroom is going to be perfect. So the classroom was probably from about here over. So you can imagine a really big room. And it looked especially big because it was empty. And he said, oh, this is perfect. This is a perfect room because, look, you have your own door to the outside. That's going to be fabulous because the bus is going to be able to come right up to the door, and your kids are going to be able to come right in from their bus, right into the classroom. And then he said, oh, and I should take you down and show you like where the kids are going to eat lunch. And so we're walking down to the cafeteria, and along the way, he's showing me the gym and tells me about how the kids are going to have their own special time for gym. And then we pass the playground, and he says, oh, and we've arranged for your kids to have their own special time at the playground. And, I'm walking down to this cafeteria getting madder and madder and madder. And I'm becoming quite defensive, right, for these kids that I have not even met yet. And we get to the cafeteria, and lo and behold, there's a special little room where we're going to eat apart from everybody else. And I just blew my top, and this was just the first time I blew my top at this principal. I actually threw carpet squares at him one day. I was young and cocky, I told you. But anyway, so I said, well, they eat with normal people at home. I think they can do it here. And, he just wouldn't hear of that. Because in his mind, the students were going to be included. This was, early days of inclusion, right? And yet my kids were not going to even be breathing the same air as everybody else, right? They were going to be completely separate. And so I had a very politicized view of disability from that day forward. And I started thinking about, so why am I here? Am I here for them, or am I here to protect everybody else from these students? Is that why I'm here? So that everybody else doesn't have to deal with these kids? And so when I was in my doctoral program, I thought, well, where can I go get sort of a critical theory or critical way of looking at disability? And I ended up getting a grad certificate in women's studies, and that's sort of how I came to disability studies, was through feminist theory. And I think part of that also taught me about the value of life writing and memoir. Because in other critical fields, women's studies and African American studies, critical race theory, life writing is absolutely part of how you do theory, right? The personal was the political, was the rally cry back in the day, and so I don't have as much baggage about life writing being apolitical as some of my disability studies colleagues do, and I think that's why. I also find that in teacher education, we're used to using narrative. We're used to assigning a memoir, and we don't necessarily have the baggage about it. But I wanted to make sure that you understood that it's not universally understood to be necessarily political, okay? But that's why I see life stories as really having a lot of potential. The other thing that I think life stories do is they do particular kinds of cultural work. So particular things that I think are really valuable about them is that they really subvert mind-body dualisms. Often when you're talking about life writing, they're very embodied. And this idea of the personal and the social and the political and the body and the mind are all really entangled in productive ways. I think sometimes the social model of disability can elide the body. Because they don't want to deal with impairment, the body sort of becomes too complicated. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the social consequences of disability. Let's talk about the politics. Let's not necessarily engage with the body. And so, these are some of the kinds of cultural works that I think these memoirs can do. And I think, drawing on from that women's studies background, it's never politically insignificant for individuals who have been denied subjectivity and selfhood to write themselves into being. And I think this was written about black feminist, from a black feminist framework, but it absolutely fits in terms of disability. I don't think there's a group that has been denied subjectivity in the same sorts of ways as people with disabilities. And so from that perspective, I think, life writing is absolutely important and critical in terms of our understandings of disability. So this transgressive potential and narrative written from hidden corners, disability life writing is a site of intellectual and political resistance. As Audre Lorde wrote, to define ourselves, to name ourselves, to speak for ourselves, instead of being defined and spoken for by others. This is the value of the personal story. And again, if we connect back to the ways of knowing that's predominated our field, I think this really demonstrates this. And yet, and I'm thinking about teacher ed here, we can't assume that a disability narrative will be politically grounded. Just because I'm a woman doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be a feminist. Just because I have a disability does not mean I'm going to have a politicized view of that disability. And so I think we have to understand that those cultural scripts of the overcoming, those are out there in the world. And if I'm a person with a disability, I may identify with that story. I may feel that story is my story. And so I think, that's again why I think we have to deal with those kinds of texts as well. I think there's a tendency for students to see these texts as inspirational. It's tied to that way of reading those kinds of narratives. I think students can overdetermine disability as the salient identity. And I think that means that we have to come up with narratives that are complicated in terms of race and gender, social class, nation, sexuality. Sometimes I have students say, well, this is nice, but what do I do Monday morning, right? So how can I use this, right, in the classroom? I also think that students can over or under identify with the text. Now, what do I mean by that? It's possible in these texts that students can say, well, I've had students say, well, I must have a learning disability too, because everything that they talk about, I feel like that's, my experience, or, and that would be sort of an over-identification. I think they can also under-identify with some of these stories. Like that has nothing to do with me. Why would I read that? It's not the kind of kids that I'm going to be teaching. It's written from an adult perspective. How is this really related to what I do? And so I often read a poem to students. It's one of the shortest poems I've read. And I'm trying to think, Megan, if I've read this. I'm blanking on the author, so that's why I'm struggling here. It's Pat Parker. Do you know the poem? The title is almost longer than the poem. The title is For the White Person Who Wants to Be My Friend. Do you know it? The first line, never forget that I am black. Second line, oh, sorry, I messed it up. First line, forget that I am black. Second line, never forget that I am black. And so this is the edge that we are traveling, in terms of under and over identification with a narrative that I think we have to help students negotiate. How do they see this script as connected to their life, but not own it in such a way that the person's story becomes beside the point, kind of a boomerang perception, like enough about you and your story, let's talk about me, kind of thing. And so here we're going to get to our handout. And I think what I have come to really think about is how do we help students read these texts that bring out the really wonderful potential I see in them. And so I have this here, and we don't have to read the whole thing now. I made it so you can take it with you. I collated this list of 20 reading practices from a couple different sources. The first one is, and I have them on the back, the very last one on the bibliography is Smith and Watson, Reading Autobiography, A Guide for Interpreting Life Writing. That's a really wonderful chapter in a book, and they provided a lot of interesting sort of tools for looking at narrative. I also use G, list of tools, how to do discourse analysis, a toolkit. This is a brand new book out by G, who does critical discourse analysis, and the whole book is like a toolkit. And so I borrowed some of those, and then some of them just come from my own teaching. Janet Miller, Mark Sherry, Ellie McKay, other people, Susan Baglieri, who have done work on narrative. And so the critical reading practices talk about ways that you can encourage students to look a little bit deeper in the text. So not just on the surface of the text, but things like time. You know, time is really interesting in these disability life writing, because one of the things that you want to see is, where does the disability come into the picture? Is it the first story that's told? Or is there life before disability, disability life after disability? Is the, you know, where does disability figure in the narrative in terms of time? Critical incidences. And there we read for things that are there, but also things that are not there. What are the most important experiences that they want to share? Why are they sharing these and not others? What are the themes that run through these critical incidences? Are there silences, erasures, things that are not said? Are there things that are sort of hinted to, but maybe not talked about in any sort of depth? These are some of the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about these works. We also think about how we're called as readers to the text. So how are we spoken to? How are we encouraged to think about this person in a particular way? So, and Elizabeth Ellsworth calls that calling, like how are we called or hailed to the text? So these are just, just like a little gift for you to use, in whatever way you would like. But I found them to be really productive places to start. And I thought what would be fun is if we did a few together, okay? So it's Friday night. And I don't want you to just be passive tonight. And so I thought we would do some of these things together. And so I brought some disability life writing. I'm going to have one that's auditory, and so we'll just listen to the story, and some that we'll read together. We'll put you in groups and sort of have you look at some of these things, okay? Does that sound cool? Okay. So the first one is Nancy Meyers. And Nancy Meyers is somebody I have read for a very, very long time. She's a prolific disability life writer. And she has MS, and she is no longer able to write, which saddens me greatly because I just love her work. She uses a lot of metaphors in her writing, but she talks about herself as embodying metaphor. There's a great essay that she writes about being at the airport, and she's talking about marginality. And she says, marginality is where I live. You know, I'm constantly being wheeled over to the side, of groups of people and living over here on the margin. And so, in critical theory, we might talk about marginality, but what does it mean to feel that in an embodied way? And so I think that's really wonderful. And the piece of text that we're going to look at from hers is really about the politics of naming and how we identify ourselves and how she decides to identify herself. And so we'll be doing that one. This is Georgina Cleage, and I'll set this up for you. She has written what I'll call life writing, but it's really a series of letters to Helen Keller. And Helen Keller is somebody that she grew up hating as a blind woman. She became blind when she was around 11, I think. And Helen Keller was always positioned as this icon that she was supposed to live up to. And so she just always found Helen Keller to be really annoying. And so she decided to write this series of letters. And you can't hate Helen Keller, right? It's just not allowed, right? And so she wrote this series of letters to Helen Keller. And I call it life writing because I think you'll see in the piece that she's going to read that she's very much present in this text. She's going to address Helen in these letters as you, And so she asked the audience, you're supposed to take the role of Helen Keller, and I queued this up so you didn't have all of that background. So you're just going to hear this one letter, and the letter has to do with Helen Keller being accused of plagiarism when she's, I think, 11 years old. Do you guys know the story of that? Okay, so you'll hear about it. Some of you, it might spark a memory.
So Helen has Helen, has just said that she knows where and when this reading of the story took place. You know that's when it happened. Miss Lawson is spelling into your hand, but you can't remember it happening? How can that be, Helen? It can be because it is, you think, but don't say. Memory is like that.
So the part that I want you to really focus on is this early part in the piece where she's talking about talking about how Helen knows things, okay?
You know you were there. You have been there since. When you go there, you remember being there before. You know that certain events took place there, but do you remember the events or just the telling of the events? What was the question? How can you know and not remember? What a question. It astonishes me that you don't call them on it. You know a lot of things you don't remember. You know you were born, but you don't remember that. You know when you were 18 months old, you had a fever, and when it passed, you were deaf and blind, but you don't remember that either. Is that in question now, too? How are you supposed to know how you know what you know and how you remember what you remember? You're 11 years old. You should say, "Get serious, people. Are you listening to yourselves?" But that is not how you operate. You really want to answer this question, really want to prove to them that you were acting in good faith, just a little girl trying to do something nice for the nice man who runs her school, not a ruthlessly calculating plagiarist bent on self-promotion and personal gain. Think, you tell yourself. Think, teacher tells you sometimes and taps you on the forehead. But that's not how you think of thinking. You know you have a brain in there, and the brain is the place where ideas and memories and dreams take place. But to you, it doesn't feel like the place where you know things. You know things because you touch them. You pick them up. You move your hands over and around them. You know things through your hands, the squared off patch of palm where words are spelled, the soft tips of your fingers where you feel the dots of braille. You know things as texture and vibration. You know them through your hands, your chest, the tuning fork of your ribs, the soles of your feet. You taste too, of course, and you smell things. But when you inhale scents, they go down your throat and feel like tastes. They don't rise into your brain. Miss Lawson touches your arm. "I'm thinking," you say. And then you add, "I'm trying to find the right words to explain." Then you say, "Back then, I didn't know as many words as I know now. Back then, the things I could name were things I could touch. I knew the word for water, but didn't know the word for clouds." You lift your free hand and point to the ceiling briefly, then you stop, because you don't want them to think you don't know there aren't clouds indoors. You go on. "Back then, when people read books to me," you say people because it was not just teacher. It was your mother, it was Mrs. Hopkins. You say, "When people read books to me, I didn't understand every word. Sometimes I only understood every 10th word. Sometimes, even when I read to myself in Braille, I didn't understand every word. Sometimes I'd skip to the words I knew. I know how much it costs you to admit this, Helen. You feel shame at your former self's ineptitude. You wish you could claim to have known more then. You wish you had always been the superstar student you are now. I know how much it costs you because I've been there myself. When I was 11, I lost my sight, but I passed as sighted for a long time. I didn't like to say, I can't read that, or I can't see where you're pointing, because it made me sound stupid. But this is the price you have to pay. You have to expose your former self's lack of understanding. It's the whole point. Back then, you didn't know, didn't understand. You go on. Sometimes after someone read a story to me, I would ask questions, or I would ask them to tell me the story again. And I couldn't always tell if they were reading the story over to me or telling it again using different words. And sometimes someone would tell me a story, and I didn't know if it was a story from out of a book or a story that they had made up out of your free hand fingers the air, fingering it like cloth, whole cloth, thin air. Out of thin air, you say, out of imagination. Back then, I couldn't always tell which was which. Now, sometimes when I read a story, it seems familiar to me, and I think it must be because somebody read it to me back then before I fully understood. And sometimes I think it's because a lot of stories are like a lot of other stories, like the stories in Greek mythology. Again, you say this for Mr. Anagnos because you want him to remember the many conversations you've had together, how he always used to praise you and call you his special friend. But thinking this makes your lower lip tremble, so you suck it between your teeth and bite down.
So, these are just a couple little examples, okay? There's a million others that I brought a whole bunch and didn't know how much time we would take. But I want to leave with a couple burning questions. Thank you. The first one is, whose lives are worth narrating? One of the activities I do with students is I make them make a bibliography of published narratives. And then we chart them in terms of which disabilities are represented, not represented, which racial groups are represented, not represented. And I think that, we have to do a little bit more work to capture diverse sets of memoirs because, we have to go to YouTube, we have to go to blogs and zines and all of these. Some of the ones that I brought was Larry Bissonet's blog, a great source of narrative. I just read another blog from a young girl that I think is just brilliant. And so there's lots of stuff out there. It may not be published, and I think those are really important. I think with students, you have to help them resist overgeneralizing or feeling like you have some access to the truth about disability. One of the ways that I do this is I often assign multiple memoirs of people that have the same disability, like Lynn Manning and Georgina Cleage, but come from very different social groups otherwise, to sort of complicate that there's one true experience of blindness. How to tease out the embedded socio-political critique. I think that's what some of these reading practices can do, and some of these shared conversations, like what is the author doing here? What stereotypes are they responding to? What are they helping us to see differently? How to think about authorship or self and other with collaboratively produced texts. I think Doug Bicklin's work here with collaboratively produced narratives is really, really interesting and important work. How to account for what's missing in the genre. Again, that could be racial groups that are missing or disability experiences that are missing, parent stories. There's lots of other things that we could talk about. And then how to remember that the person never stays in one place. And so this is, Lynn Manning's experience at a particular moment in time. And he's not frozen there, even though the memoir is frozen there. And so I think that's always important. And so I'm going to close with just a little quote. that says, read critically, memoir becomes an intervention into the politics of knowledge and representation. Thus, memoir should not be seen as counter to theory or politics, but should be understood as a form of social action for their ability to talk back to dominant scripts and point to a more embodied form of social critique. Refusing to cede to any one authoritative discourse, disability memoir is theory that, as Mayer says, stays close to the bone. And that's the end.